Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. To open the case for the negating team, I'd like to welcome up the first negating speaker.
All right, give me a second. I'm setting up my timer. Just to confirm I'm audible, right? Okay, okay. Thank you. So speech 3, 2, 1. Let's first analyze what did the first affirmative said. They say because these countries do not have as much capability, because these countries have so many other things to focus on, that's the exact point in which we do not have to let them we do not have to burden them with this downstreaming. Instead, we should focus not focus on upstreaming, but instead focus on downstreaming. There is a few rebuttals that we wanted to give. Firstly, they say that there is a fair negotiation that would happen, but this is not as simple as first actually say, because the context of developing countries that there is corruption happening in place. It's not as simple as, oh, we can just simply control on how much these international companies can take from our country. We can just simply like control the cap and how and what are the prices that we can actually have for them to take. In fact, it is more likely to happen for corruption to happen in which these foreign companies would just pay just some side money for the legislators in order for them to take more than what they can actually what they can actually take. This is more likely to happen because all the operations is only available locally under your side of the house, which means that all of the operations cannot be audited by international auditors to audit and look at all the corruption that is happening in your country. This is also the same point that would go against their point of how these companies will exploit their country, right? Secondly, they say that the country would only have to focus on social services because this is something that people care about. We say that it's not true because people also care about the economical impacts that the governing party rules. With the increase of social media and literacy, sure, your characterization might happen 20 years back, but not today. With many more people changing the perspective on what should matter in a political party and what are the manifestos, I don't think that I don't think that this characterization and framing is especially true. This means that under people on the ground, there's also incentive for the people to care about economical development in their country. Secondly, let's go on to the setup, right? Because I think I've did a bad job about this. What is a developing country to begin with, right? Because these developing countries don't only mean that they only depend solely on this one form of economy. We have countries like Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia, where they have other forms and resources. But this does not mean that mineral raw earth is a small source of revenue, right? It is still a big one in which this country heavily relies on to increase the GDP. This developing country still have the substantial interest in the market because these countries can still dictate and control the prices of the mineral. They can still have a say in conventions in which you can control on how much you export in order to stabilize the prices to begin with. This looks like rubber, oil, and everything else that is in the debate today, right? So the countries have more, like the second thing about this framing is that these countries have much more earth minerals than they need. This means that these countries are already self-sufficient with what they have. Imagine storing all this inside of your country and not exporting them just for the sake of development that is not sure to actually happen. So what does downstreaming look like then? This looks like companies such as Shell and Caltex coming to Malaysia, and they pay a premium to Malaysia and have the right for them to take our resources. They have to defend this specific instance of companies coming in and take our resources and sell them only in that country because you only want the export to only be circulated in them. What would we support then? What is our stance essentially, right? Because we would support local companies like Petronas and rare earth companies to export. We want these local companies to sell whatever that they have to export, and we want direct economical business for the companies to flourish. For these companies to still drill and outsource the company globally, we are not sure on who are the users. Like on the user of DAOs, we are not sure of who are the users of the rare earth minerals to begin with because they have never characterized this. But under user of DAOs, it can only be used by the local people since the characterization that they're not as developed means that their usage will be much less. So at that point in time, I'm not sure on how much I'm not sure on how your resources are going to be used effectively because they are not as developed, they don't use as much as developing country does. So firstly, the argument, right? So there is a principal need for the countries to have sovereignty, like because under your side of the house, it looks like a modern colonization because it looks like firms from developed countries build production site of raw materials in developing countries. This looks like them invading your waters, invading the borders of your country, and these people are robbed of their homeland resources like petroleum and rare minerals. In this instance, the developing country has less or no say in the economic trade of such business. This is detrimental, as for most developing countries like Brunei and Malaysia and countries in African continent, right, raw materials remain as a top source revenue of the country, which influences the country's global political power. the point in time in which you let other countries come to these places and then just simply take your resources and then just simply let them take more than what they actually need because they have a side because they have side money, they have corruption going on. It's the exact point in time in which you cannot defend your world. Your country is going to be much worse. In this instance, countries have less political say under your side of the house. One of the core functions of diplomacy and foreign policy between government is to foster economic trade. With no full control of the businesses that contributes to the most revenue, countries risk losing power in international negotiations and trade policy, in which this means that your country would have less soft power and less hard power. At the end of the day, you would have less to say. I'm not sure on how all your benefits could accrue at this point in time. Second argument on why export is a much better alternative than downstreaming, in which under our side of the house, these people can now have direct negotiation and trades of goods. We will now have more money going straight into our economy because more money can gain from our companies getting money directly from the consumers. The earth minerals that we sell are not just simply raw mineral with no processing at all. These countries still have the expertise to process them, and not just simply a country with no idea on how to process items and just simply sell them at a price. Because most countries already do have the technology in order for them to actually process this first before we sell them. It's just a matter of capacity on how much they could produce, right? That is maybe a benefit under yours of the house. But then under ours of the house, because export lead to increased investments, technological advancement and import expansion, all of which contribute to economical growth. These companies could grow better, in which this means that they can hire more people. The trickle-down effect is clear here. The economic growth can lead to further export expansion by fostering the adoption of technology and increasing the level of import use as inputs for export-oriented production. But still, they say, oh, we still do not have enough expertise or things like that, right? We can still have them by sending our students to overseas universities or collaboration with foreign companies in order to learn on how they do all this, in which we can co-opt all of their benefits, right? So what are the impacts of this? Firstly, we could increase a currency value which is exclusive to side negative, because now more money can come into the country because these local companies can create their own source of income instead of only hoping on like foreign companies to come in and actually produce whatever that they need, right? By having these companies sell outside of the country, this can also increase our GDP, which is the only way for us to strengthen our economy by having the money cash flow into our country to begin with. Because the problem under your side of the house, because this is such a big source of income, you do not have as much benefit because you do not allow export to get into your country. You only allow imports. Sure, you might say, oh, this is only one form of economy, but we tell you in the first framing that this is still a large and a major source of economy to begin with. So how do we benefit the community at large then? Because under our side of the house, if you do not only focus on downstreaming, you also focus on upstreaming, in which this means that these local companies can still then have the also control the stage of processes of getting the crude oil to the hands of the consumer. This looks like our operation include exploring new landscapes for oil potential, discovering the crude oil, drilling and extracting it, and the initial discovery part. All of this requires people, and all of this requires locals for us to be there to begin with. And we bite the bullet. There might be a less of expertise that we have, but there is much more capability for other countries, for these developing countries to do this, because it's almost a brute force job, in which not require as much expertise from the local as downstreaming, in which at this point in time, we take on how we could create much more profits for this country can create, which is exactly the benefit, the metric of this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to continue the case for the negating team, I'd like to welcome up the second speaker.
Hello, can I check if I am audible? Thank you. Give me a moment to start my timer. All right. Once again, I am Hasbul. No preferred gender pronouns. Sorry. Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think that the side of affirmative has this really weird assumption that the point in which that we actually allow these foreign countries to come in and invest and build factories within this developing country, somehow they're going to be extremely benevolent, and they would not be like profit incentivized in order to maximize profit that they can get from the resources of this developing country, right? This speech will do a few things. Firstly, I would like to have one piece of reclarification that I think needs to be made in this round. Secondly, I'll have a few responses that I have towards the speaker before me. And lastly, I'll talk to you about 3 main questions I have in this debate. Number 1, why is exports or industrialization much more preferable in the context of this developing country? Secondly, why does downstreaming actually hurt the position of this developing country within the global economy? And lastly, why does this whole power asymmetry that happens, that affirmative try to talk about, happens much more under that side of the house? But firstly, one clarification that I think needs to be made. What does downstreaming actually look like? So I think that downstreaming actually looks like foreign companies looks like foreign companies coming in to this developing country, taking their natural resources and actually profiting from what they have actually gained. The reason is why I bring this up is because they didn't engage with the first argumentation coming from first negative to suggest to you that it is actually like it's principally unjust for them to do this, is because it literally impacts the sovereignty of this particular state. But I will explain further as to why this particular principle is actually important, right? So firstly, a few responses. Number 1, this whole argumentation coming from the second affirmative to suggest to us that they'll be able to help the local economies of these developing countries even more. Number 1, they told us that now they will have a better ability to actually negotiate with these developing countries. And number 2, that even if they do something bad to you, they can take away their business permits, etc., etc. Number 1, I think that there is, like, and as my first negative has already pointed out, there is a level of corruption that can actually occur. Therefore, like, even if I don't think that this whole threat of them taking away their business profits, their business permit is actually something that is likely to happen, because you can just pay them off. But secondly, this whole analysis to try to prove to us that the corporations will actually care about these countries. Number 1, I think these corporations are like profit driven. So I don't think like all of these international standards that a second affirmative tries to talk about, I don't think it actually matters, because as long as they make money, they will be more than happy to stay. And I don't think this whole like idea that there's going to be a stigma towards these global firms. I think that these global firms have enough resources and capacity to actually run away from such stigma. They can control the media, etc. And I don't think that investors would actually pull out as long as they make money, right? But secondly, this whole idea as to how now the people in these developing countries will have the opportunities to actually hold higher positions and have much more agency under that sort of house. I think that the point in which that these corporations want to have their own firms and have their own like standing within this country, I don't think there is a likelihood of these firms to actually care about to give these people on the ground within developing countries. And they have considered within their speeches that these people don't have the education and don't have the amount of skills. I don't see as to why they would actually give these high positions in the first place. I don't see the logical link within this argumentation. All right. So now let's move towards the first question, right? So, let's move on to the first question, right? As to why industrialization is something that is much more preferable. Number one, let's have a bit of context first. We're talking in the context of a developing country, right? That means that it is a growing economy. There is a process of pursuing more infrastructure development, and like they eventually want to break out of this shell of a developing country, right? So firstly, let's ask the question: why is industrialization likely? Because I think the affirmative says that it is unlikely to happen. Number one, I think it is likely to happen because like there is an incentive that exists by the state, right? They want to create like local job opportunities. They want to like there will be political pressure by people on the ground for them to actually industrialize. But secondly, I think that the point is that this developing country, for example, has an oil depository, they would want to like develop it in order to maximize the profit, right? Because like the point in which that they can do that is the point in which that they can actually make much more they can make much more money from this natural resource. But thirdly, what did affirmative say? They said that they prefer downstreaming because of a few things. Number one is that they can limit the harvesting of the resources of these things. I think this is unlikely to happen because number one, you concede that it is rich in this mineral, right? Therefore, I think that if they want to maximize profit, it's point in which that they are likely to sell this away more. But secondly, this whole idea as to how are they going to have this mineral sold much more locally. I don't think this is also likely because the point in which that these corporations realize that they can make much more money outside, like they can take these resources and actually develop it and sell it for much more money outside. I don't think they're going to sell it locally. But lastly, right, is this whole idea that there is a need for development of the social services. That is why the government is unable to pursue the means of actually industrialization. Understand that the prerequisite for you to actually access and improve things like social structures and all these infrastructures is actually money. Therefore, regardless, before you want to engage in these things, you need to make money, and that's why export and industrialization is much better. It's because we can actually sell, we can actually have the capacity to sell these things. Sure, we might not have these resources immediately, but I think over time, eventually we can have these things as well, because I think that we also have the capacity to actually approach investors for their money as well. I don't think that the only avenue of money is actually downstreaming. Second question: why downstreaming hurts the position of this developing country? Number one, first negative told you it is literally limiting the sovereignty, right? Therefore, there's less control over this resource. You have to surrender this to somebody else. The reason as to why this is important is because we want them. This is because literally the people who are going to control this is the foreign investors, the foreign firms. We don't want this to happen. But secondly, I think it is unstrategic to give away, right? Because understand, you're already in a position whereby you have these resources. So the political positioning changes. Now you're only going to be seen as the provider of these raw materials instead of the person who is actually selling it. But lastly, because there'll be an inability for you to set up the economic sector because now you're unable to sell, right? But lastly, I'll tell you, the reason is to why the power symmetry happens more under that side of the house, because you literally cannot approach negotiations in a fair way. With that, I thank you.
I thank the speaker for the speech, and to close the substantive portion of the affirming team's case, I'd like to welcome up the third affirming speaker.
Hello, am I audible and visible? Cool, thank you. So I don't have any gender preferences. Cool. Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and we posited to you that it is precisely when we allow for developing countries to be beholden to things like international law or power disparities that inherently exist with stronger and weaker economies that exist on a global scale, that you allow for things like massive exploitation and the general just destruction of a lot of normal economies that exist in these developing countries. I'll talk about 3 things in my speech. One, is sovereignty a good thing? Two, what does development look like in our world? And three, why is the world op generally encourages bad for the country in the long term? First issue then on sovereignty and just general development. Notably, they claim two things. The first claim is that there's no sovereignty with downstreaming. Why is this wrong? They don't give proof other than these countries cannot choose to export these products, which is not even notably true. Downstreaming is just by virtue of the info slide, the banning of export of raw materials, not the export of these raw materials being processed and turned into things like tech products and services. Meaning, we can still do things like take the country's super rare rock that can be processed and developed to things like maybe quantum computers and then ship them to these countries abroad and sell them within the country. There's no means through which we are banning these things in the first place. I think that's quite good. But even if it were true that we are infringing on the sovereignty of these other countries, I would argue that it's completely fine if we take sovereignty if it means the local industry and economy of these developing countries are better produced, if it means we can better control global exploitation of powerful countries that are able to make unsustainable trade deals and exploit these resources, if it means we're able to ensure the long-term sustainability of developing countries' economy. And precisely because the mechanism that's given to you by our first two speakers, that we're not beholden to things like international trade laws or disproportionate power dynamics that exist with economically stronger countries that prove that things like sovereignty, even if might be important in the vacuum, are not as important in this debate, and it's something that we'd rather remove if it means either just general protection of these developing economies. The second claim that they bring to you is that there's no development because a lot of these things are centralized within the country. We explain that we get more development for numerous reasons. One, there's less capital needed because of a lot of the infrastructure and manufacturing is likely put into your country by virtue of you requiring them to set up shop in the country in the first place. Two, the tech in and of itself is brought to your country, i.e. things like communication, i.e. things like natural investment by foreign investors are likely to be brought into your country in order to do things like maximize profit, maximize services, and maximize their ability to do things like process this like mineral and do things like sell it in your country. It's things like more money that exists on your side precisely because the internal economy exists and you're just generally able to like keep more money in your economy and just generally develop a lot of things. Or even three, that you force people to develop things like the local industry rather than abstract things like social services that people might prefer in a way, precisely because of like the just general analysis that my second speaker told you, that you are likely to focus on the side of opposition on things like social services first. Well, like in the case of Venezuela, where they prioritized this because of it's just what people voted for them in or what people wanted. That proves precisely because these are more beneficial to people. That prove that it's things precisely because you rely on an export economy, that you're unable to do things like naturally industrialize or adapt to what the globe needs in the first place. The second thing is to note is just why this like claim is wrong in the first place. I think it's untrue that we can't export. I think it's already quite clear why the nuances of downstream allow for so. But the second reason why this is wrong, so the clear outcome of this is that we still get things like trade, like exports, like international relations. Even if it were true for some reason that our country were isolationist and self-sustained, why is it notably fine? Notably, they don't prove why we need international relations to sustain economy. So even in the absolute worst case, that no company or country opts into this idea of downstreaming in our country, I would argue that it's precisely because of things like globalization and interconnectedness of economies that make it hard for countries to choose how they want to develop their industry in the interest of bettering and supporting foreign wants and industries rather than the local wants and needs of people. It is precisely because even if no country traded was good at this, we would presumably develop a country that was able to sustain itself, to protect the interests of the people, to industrialize their economy and generate a well-functioning country. I.e., look at examples like Japan, look at examples like Korea, who are able to do things like well adjust the global economy even after coming from a notably isolationist background that prove things. One, it is not inherent that we need things like a global industry or global trade in order to have a country that has a successful and functioning economy in general. But also two, that it is precisely because in some aspect of global interconnectedness and the inability for countries to choose to be isolationist that make it so that a lot of the interests of things like industrialization or a lot of the interests of people and local industry are forgone for in the interest of things like foreign interests, such as being able to build roads and infrastructure for things like trade or for things like exports and imports that prove that generally it might not be good, even if you're able to just generally not be isolationist on the side opposition. The second issue then is just notably on comparative. Why is our comparative far better? And why is the world that up encourages just bad for the country in the long term? We've told you two notable things. The first is that we have faster development in technologies. That is to say, it's not just factories that exist because these countries want to take mineral resources and then they will exploit them and then make them into some small product and then export them to the other country. But it's rather because the process of these things are rather tedious, foreign investors likely actively encourage other foreign investors to enter into the country in order to make their production and sale of processed products far quicker and more efficient. And we can see this with like just numerous different foreign industries that normally take place in a lot of these developing countries, inviting other foreign investors in the interest of things like trade, in the interest of things like partnerships or further selling their products that they were able to create and process into these economies. That prove two things. One, it's not likely to be singular insofar as they will just get our resources, process them, and then export them to other countries, but rather it is the like active development and engagement within the country that allows for faster development and the just general safer economy and industrialization that exists on our side. But two, that it's not necessarily that all of the funding and all of the benefits will likely go abroad, precisely because one, we not only have more legal power to be able to ensure that these things don't happen, given it's happening in our country, but also two, that we have a direct incentive to be able to want to ensure that the economy is local. Insofar as they are the ones taking our resources, there's a direct incentive for the government at least want to be able to ensure these services reach to people or the money reach to people in some form or some way. They question how can we better control these things and limit corruption. We give you two notable responses. One, it's precisely because these companies are beholden to the country that they're able to do things like make laws, limitations, and economic policies that benefits the country itself rather than the foreign industry. We can do things like limit how much resource is taken in a year, a month, or even a day, or limit how much foreign businesses can set up in a certain region of the country, or things like determining how much local workers need to work in these companies, or how much local businesses need to exist in that area. That prove that things like local businesses, that prove that things like domestic economies are far better protected on our side, precisely when they're beholden to our laws and not international laws. But two, the question of corruption and accountability and why it's far worse on their side. Notably, they claim things like corruption being bad when the country is able to have power over different aspects of the country. If you presume this to be true on our side, and our government is presumably extremely corrupt and would like pocket a lot of the funds and earnings that come from the manufacture and exportation of our processed resources, there is a symmetric harm that exists on the side of government where they will also be corrupt. We explain that it is worse when you export and are corrupt because of three reasons. One, it's hard to track money because by the time you track it, the money could have been halfway across the world, split into 5 different countries with different laws that they're able to abide by. Two, it's easier to be untransparent because these products leave the country, which means it's easy to track funds and money stays in that country, but not funds and products that leave it under the table. Negotiations or pocketed money are a lot harder to track. But three, there's less accountability on the state because the state doesn't actually have control over the full process of things like manufacturing and limiting these countries. They can either blame foreign countries for this lacking or bad trade deals and remove accountability for themselves, or just feign ignorance and oversight because these were not things that they were directly responsible for in the first place. All of these prove three things. One, accountability and negotiations far better on our side. Two, we're able to better invest in our economy and ensure that the economy is more stable in the long term. And three, just generally proves that sovereignty is a non-issue in debate and ought to be something that we not necessarily protect. All of these reasons proposed.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now, as is customary, we reverse the speaking order and half speaking times, and I'd like to welcome back up the leader of the negating team to deliver the neg reply.
Hello, just to check, am I visible and audible? Right, thank you. Give me a moment. Okay. Starting my wait, my timer, sorry. Okay, all right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think it is important for us to remember that the context we're developing is the context of a developing country. And I will prove to you in this reply why were we the best team that actually catered to the needs of this developing country in the first place. But firstly, I think it is important to note that within today's debate, the burden was for both sides of the house, like in the context of this developing country, under which model would it bring more benefits for this developing country, right? So whether or not we were actually able to maximize profit or whether or not we were actually able to benefit them in the long term run. A few strategic analysis that I think I need to make for the side of affirmative. Number one, I think they assume the benevolence of foreign corporations, right? And we told you consistently throughout the three speakers that they are unlikely to be benevolent. Why? Because they are profit incentivized, therefore they only care about making money. Therefore, I think the negotiations that they will bring towards this developing country will be negotiations that are only focused about making money, right? And they literally concede within their speakers that there exists a power asymmetry for developing countries. So I don't see as to how these things will actually give these developing countries a leverage to actually shift or sway these negotiations in their favor. Number two, I don't think that they properly lined out like the clear incentives of a developing country, right? So number one, I think that we need to understand that developing countries eventually want to be developed as well. And I think that the cycle of downstreaming just continues to lock them within the cycle, right? And this whole idea as to how there is a social service prioritization that exists within status quo, and that is why industrialization cannot happen. I think this doesn't take into account that the prerequisite for these things to happen is actually money in the first place. And we've already proven to you consistently throughout our three speakers that reason as to why we don't want corporations to come in is because they limit the money, the money for these things to actually happen. But even at their best, right, they never explain to us until what end would they allow downstreaming to happen. So I don't think that the cycle has a likely end at the end of the day. But thirdly, I think there was a weird shift in their case coming in third affirmative, because suddenly now he says that export is not possible, yet they considered within the first affirmative that these developing countries are like they solely rely on the exports of these raw materials. So I don't see as to how export of other things are actually possible. So three issues as to why we take this burden and why we take this debate. Number one, on the capital and the economic output, right? Because under that side of the house, they're actually unable to actually control the flow of money, because the ones who are doing the business is literally the foreign corporations. I think the corporations are more likely to take over, and like literally all like the main benefit that the developing countries will have is just the permits that these corporations will have to pay. So I don't see what are the actual trickle-down effects. What are the trickle-down effects? And even though affirmatives try to argue these things such as, oh, they're actually able to hire these people, this is how the second issue deals with this, as to how we actually benefit the people or the lives of the people on the ground. Because these corporations are profit incentivized, therefore they prioritize money. I think it's more likely for them to actually invest in cheap labor, right? They also consider that there is a low skill labor force that exists within different countries. I don't think that they will be paid a lot as well. They don't really care about these people. But lastly, and I think most importantly, I argue to you that the sovereignty literally is harmed, because they literally cannot. What happens towards these natural resources, the ones who are in control are these foreign investors and are these corporations. Therefore, we take this debate. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for what was a really good, really close debate with lots of, I think, quite good direct clashing on the main issues. That was really great to see. In terms of how this OA will work, I'll give the decision and then reasoning. And then in terms of feedback, please feel free to reach out to me and the entire panel. We all saw the debate quite similarly, and I would encourage you to ask everyone for feedback. So in terms of result, on a relatively close margin, we gave the debate to the affirming team, so congratulations. In terms of where we saw this debate come down to, I think broadly two main issues. Firstly, which side had more scope to eliminate or mitigate the extent of exploitation? And then secondly, where there was more scope for development and economic growth. On this first issue of where there was more scope for mitigating exploitation, the push from the negating team is that these companies setting up in local countries and carrying out processes there to export these finished products amounts to modern day colonization, where these companies are able to set up locally and have total capacity to take and process as many resources as they want. They're able to keep profits for themselves and end up harming locals, both by stealing their resources, but also keeping the jobs out of their hands and keeping that profit for the companies themselves. They contrast this to the status quo, where exporting gives money directly to the nations that are exporting these goods, and this money is what can later be used to improve the economic state of the nation. I think the affirming team has two broad prongs of attack here. The first is a way to mitigate the level of control that these companies have when they're based in your nation and all of those processes happen under your jurisdiction. They tell us that the way that these contracts are set up will likely be far more influenced by locals when the entire process takes place in your nation. You're able to do things like step in and hold the government more accountable at any step in the process where you believe locals are getting a bad deal. And they compare that to the only influence you have when your nation is just taking the raw materials and exporting them. They tell us that in these cases, it becomes far easier to obfuscate any bad deals or to be strong-armed into accepting, for example, cheap prices. I think the affirming team probably needed to do slightly more under this analysis to explain the way that this regulation works and why it was necessarily the case that that regulation would be better if that relative power was the same either way and the thing being exported was the same. But I think where they're able to kind of add to this analysis and give it slightly more credibility is when they discuss the relative power you have when your only capacity to access these resources is by setting up in that nation entirely. They tell us that in those cases, companies care significantly more about not being driven out of the nation. And I think that's a significant enough incentive that the behavior of these companies is likely to be kind of in line with what governments expect for them. And I think it is reasonable for the affirming team to be able to claim that governments will have some capacity to regulate these nations. Like, I think it's a little bit difficult to buy that these companies would be able to just take these resources without having any level of interaction with local governments at any stage. The second way that the affirming team deals with this exploitation material as well is to clash the negating conception of economic exploitation with a competing conception, which is regarding the sustainability of supply of these minerals when they aren't being endlessly sold or supplied. They tell us that if all parts happen within the country, there's significantly more incentives on the companies themselves to also make sure that they're not totally running materials into the ground because they likely want to keep carrying on that entire process, and they're no longer able to just on sell for extremely high prices and set up bad deals to get those resources in the first place when they're entirely placed in that country. How does the negating team reply to these attacks from the affirming team? I think the problem for the negating team here is that the extent of response to this analysis is that these companies are likely not to care about things like reputational harm when they have significantly more kind of negotiation power, being the ones that are processing these products. I think the issue is that that doesn't engage with all of the work that the affirming team does to demonstrate how the success of these companies becomes reliant on the nation that they're set up in to some extent. So they require those nations to have stability, to have a stable supply, to make sure that people want that company in there in the first place. But I think the second thing to say, and perhaps slightly more determinant of this clash, is that the negating team doesn't necessarily engage with current incentives on these external nations to import as much product as possible and deplete that supply quickly. I think the impact of all of this analysis is to say that exploitation can largely be minimized on the affirming team, or at the very least be somewhat comparable to the current scenario where there is large-scale exporting and it is reasonable to believe that supply of these rare minerals is being depleted. Then in terms of where there's scope for economic development, and here we get two competing characterizations. From the affirming side, it is that when you set up these entire processes within the country, you get more on-flow kind of like infrastructure development, and that helps grow the economy. Whereas on the negating side, it's just that you use the profits you get from exporting these goods to grow the economy through things like industrialization. So the affirming team says that there's more economic development when there's a local setup because these companies necessarily have to run all of these processes in the country to create the final product before they're able to sell it or export that final product. And as a result of that, by necessity, they have to do things like set up infrastructure for these companies to make sure that they get things like multiple foreign investors involved. If that helps speed up the process, because all of these things can take a lot of time and require a lot of different like companies or different processes working together. They then claim that these companies, by nature of living in these nations, will care more about local people. I think that claim is not credited to the extent that the affirming team tries to run it, but I think they are able to give good analysis about the ways that just infrastructure naturally develops, and that has flow-on benefits for locals insofar as they're able to access that infrastructure, perhaps get closer to having jobs in these internationally like accredited companies that helps them, individually kind of upskill and gain more money that allows them to access things like education, which means you get a more broad level kind of tech side industrialization happening on an individual level. The negating team, in contrast, says that these exports are really important because you use the money that you gain from those exports to diversify your economy and to be able to kind of build out by industrializing. I think the problem for the negating team here, though, is that down the line, the reliance that they place within their case on the importance of exports only increases. So it becomes unclear what the pathway for diversification becomes when their own claim is that the industry and economy collapses in a world where those exports stop. Because if the conception that we get from the affirming team is true, which is that there is a natural cap to the amount of exports that you'll be able to carry out on natural resources, then it is also necessarily true that that diversification has to happen at a far earlier stage to allow for people to deal with kind of like the worst case scenario of running out of those natural resources. I think by the end of the debate, the affirming team is able to do more to demonstrate where specifically people are able to benefit off of the international supply chain in these countries to gain more relevant experience that allows for them to work even in instances where that specific processes of like their natural resources or supplying decreases. On that basis, we think that there's more sustainable growth from the affirming side, and the economy is likely to benefit from things like infrastructural investment when it happens in their country. And that's the basis we award the debate to the affirming team on.